I think it's kind of hard to explain exactly what I do for a living in one concise and understandable sentence, but I'll try anyway. My name is Jamie, and I kill various monsters, beasts, and various other paranormal beings on the request of my boss, who runs an interdimensional city under the all-binding fist of autocracy. If that sentence sounds like a confusing handful, it's because it is. Hell, I hardly even understand what I'm doing, and I've been at this job for months now. I'm not sure if I should be more floored by the fact that being a paranormal hitman is my first and only job I've ever had, or the fact that my boss first hired me during a class of summer school gone horribly awry. I was 16 at the time of my initial employment, so I was a naive and foolhardy kid who didn't really understand the gravity of what I was getting myself into. So I took the job without a second thought. So if you notice any bad decisions or poor planning on my part, blame my naivete. Before anyone objects and says how inhumane and cruel it is to hire a child as a hitman, let me assure you that my boss takes utmost caution and care one can have while commissioning a hitman. I can personally attest that my boss is always looking out for me, one way or another. It's hard to explain, but I really trust the guy. He gets me, if you know what I mean. We have a personal connection, him and I. The boss initially hired me because I happened to perfectly fit the mold of characteristics and qualities he looks for in the various clients he has around the country. He described me as brave and chivalrous when he scouted me. Two descriptions that don't really seem like qualities that a hitman would have, but you really have to look at the bigger picture to understand my boss's mindset. I'm being tasked with protecting the sum of the human population, essentially. The existence of the paranormal is largely unknown to the human race, save for a few shadowy government branches and my fellow clients tasked with dealing with them. I hunt monsters for a reason, after all. And to better aid me with this job, I was given some nifty items and a particularly special ability to boot. As soon as I agreed to become one of his clients, he gifted me with the ability to cause matter to decay at the cellular level with just a touch, a superpower my younger self would have gone nuts over. I'm expecting some questions about that statement, and all I'll say for now is that I had to find this power on my own. Boss doesn't like me asking questions about it, says that I need to find out for myself, or some nonsense like that. I don't really get his train of thought, but I trust him to know what he's talking about. I discovered this power during my first encounter with the paranormal. I was being chased by the zombified corpse of a school faculty member. Long story. In desperation, I grabbed his neck to try and get him off my tail, but I found that when I touched his neck, my hands began to smoke and I felt his neck slowly turn into ash between my palms. I prefer calling it a technique, but you can feel free to call it a superpower. I haven't exactly found a precise way to control it. It more so just activates whenever I want it to when I'm touching something with my hands. As you would imagine, this has come in super handy while on the job. My preferred method of utilization is to wait for my target to either be asleep or distracted, then I disintegrate their throat via strangulation. If they can't call for help, then it makes my job so much easier and I can eliminate them without the threat of being seen. Next, I aim for the eyes by poking them with my fingers. If the Odyssey taught me anything, it's always easier to deal with a blind monster than one that can see. I'm not implying that all of my targets even have eyes or throats to attack. I'm just laying out my preferred strategy for dealing with my targets. The ones that don't have either are far more challenging, but I've managed to deal with the few that come up. For the items I was given, I got a whole goodie bag full of them. Night vision goggles, a med kit, high-powered flashlight, and various other tools crammed inside of a backpack. Funnily enough, I've used these tools for less than I probably should on contracts. I'd say the flashlight comes in most handy, and maybe the goggles come in a close second. Normally, I would have kept my mouth shut, would it be keyboard shut, and not let any of these details fly. But my boss said it was fine to write about, stating something along the lines of, "Who would believe you anyway?" I can't really argue with that. So here I am now, typing down my experiences and stories I've had in my line of work over the past couple of months for your entertainment. If I manage to survive my upcoming contracts, then I might be able to keep updating here with new and exciting encounters with the ugly bastards I kill for a living. For today, I'd like to ease you guys and gals in with my very first assignment I was tasked with. The Dogman of Macon County. If the name didn't suggest it, this was one mean-looking son of a bitch. Imagine a 7-foot-tall burly man with the outstretched nose and snout of a canine, and who glued the hair of someone's sheepdog to his skin with Gorilla Glue. Allow me to detail how I go about finding my targets. Firstly, I receive a letter in my mailbox at a random date with pictures, location, and a brief outline of whatever target I'm assigned to. I'm given a date I need to eliminate the target by, and as long as I do so by that date, I get a sizable payment in the form of a wad of cash in the mail. It's strange to think that someone as influential and otherworldly as my boss would use the postal service to communicate with me, but I've learned that he has a certain fondness for this system, so I'm fine with him using it. These paychecks aren't cheap either, despite being an otherworldly being with alien currency. My boss has a seemingly infinite amount of money to give to me per paycheck, ranging from the thousands up to $100,000. Initially, I received my paychecks through direct deposits, but I didn't want to make my parents suspect me of doing any illegal activity when I get wired a couple grand seemingly out of nowhere. The picture I got of the Dogman was taken somewhere in the middle of the woods behind a tree, looking like one of those shoddy Bigfoot photos. Despite the poor quality of the photo, I could still make enough details on the Dogman to make me shudder. I had until Friday of next week to take this thing out, but I didn't want to let procrastination get the better of me. So I headed out the day after I got the letter, bringing with me the med kit and the goggles I got from the backpack. I told my parents a lie about having a sleepover at a friend's house, and they took the bait and wished me a good time. As I said, I was naive and didn't realize what I was getting myself into, so I never once thought that I could easily get slaughtered and die in the middle of the forest, leaving my parents with another dead child. The coordinates on the letter led me to Macon County, a small hole-in-the-wall community that looked like they skipped out on the technological zeitgeist of the 2000s. The entire community was a forested rural area full of farmlands that stretched as far as the eye can see, full of browning magenta radishes, monstrously sized potatoes, and more livestock than one could ever need. Flocks of fluffy, plump sheep and herds of fat Holstein cows ate the bountiful grass and frolicked in the plentiful farmlands. Each house and barn in the county was made of dirty wood and crumbling brick and looked to sneeze away from collapsing altogether. The most modern building they had that wasn't a drinking hole was an old McDonald's located near a farmer's market. So I paid for a large fry and parked my car in their parking lot. Once I got there, I resigned myself to playing the waiting game. It's not a fun game, but it's a game you gotta learn to play if you're trying to kill someone discreetly. Thankfully, I got to McDonald's at around 6:30 p.m., so it would only take a little over an hour for the sun to set and the moon to come up. So I sat snug in my car and munched on my oversalted fries. Once the sun finally set, I hopped out of my car and grabbed the night vision goggles and held them up to my eyes to navigate the forest where the Dogman roamed. Sadly, these goggles proved to be less effective than they were made out to be. I should have been suspicious that they looked like a bulky pair of binoculars rather than the typical military headset optometrist machine cross that real night vision goggles look like. But I was hopeful. Looking through the goggles was like looking through an old video camera from the 90s. Choppiness, grainy textures, and motion blur all over. I could see my surroundings well enough, but it wasn't up to snuff. The temperature had dropped by 10 during my hour-long waiting game, but I thought I had enough to bring a coat. What I didn't think I had to bring was any sort of weapons that would give me an edge if I had to fight this thing. I ended up picking up a big stone near a tree in case I had to put down the Dogman and bludgeon him to death. Let me tell you, that fucker can hide like you wouldn't believe. The only reason I even found the guy was a narrow, flattened makeshift path made from the scattered fallen leaves. I followed that trail and it led me to a small, cozy-looking cabin right in the middle of the woods. The county was fairly remote to begin with, but this was a step above that. Who builds a cabin in the middle of absolutely nowhere in a forest? Was living in this remote town just not isolating enough? I saw the scratched-up wooden door in the cabin rattle from side to side, so I hightailed it back and hid near some leaves to avoid being seen. Out of the door came a sight I will never forget. It was a bulky man who looked nearly 7 feet tall and covered in dark hair so coarse and thick it looked like fur walking out of the cabin, tilting his head left and right as if he were looking for someone. I was confused at first, but the gears were turning in my head. This was the Dogman. He shared the thick hair and the ridiculous height, but he lacked the canine face that the beast in the photographs had, and I knew why. This Dogman was a werewolf, and right now he was in his regular human body. I'm not implying being 7 feet tall is normal, but it's sure a hell lot closer to being normal than having a dog snout and stealing farm animals for food. The Dogman went back inside his house and rattled the door again, locking it shut. My monstrous as my target looked when he was transformed into a furry. He was still a human underneath it all. There wasn't a full moon out, so I guess it made sense that he hadn't transformed. My knowledge of werewolves is basically non-existent, but I think I understood the logic behind their furry transformation. I got up from my hiding place and walked towards his house, but I stopped dead in my tracks when I took a second to rationalize what I was doing. Was I really going to kill this guy? No, I had to take this guy out, monster or not. Monsters like him aren't supposed to be here. They're products of being exposed to the monsters roaming the city my boss rules over. Long story. How one becomes a monster is through the various beasts and energies that leak out from my boss's city, Pandemonium. It acts as something of a port city between dimensions, so all forms of beasts roam the streets at night. The guards he hires to protect the city are kind of shitty at their jobs, so he gets people like me to mop up everything that escapes from the city to Earth. However, not all monsters are made like this. It's common for those escapee monsters to attack and spread to the regular human population, increasing their numbers. I don't know if the Dogman was an escapee or a victim of an attack, but it didn't really matter. He needed to die, so I can keep the world safe and not let them find out the existence of the paranormal. The forest felt a lot lonelier and foreboding when I went over the facts, so I decided to check on the Dogman through a window in his cabin. He was fast asleep, thankfully. Taking deep breaths, I crept up to his door and placed my palm flat against the door, slowly disintegrating the spot by rotting the wood. Once my hand passed through the other side, I reached my arm around the doorknob and twisted it unlocked, and I let myself in. The Dogman was in a deep sleep, grumbling a booming snore that sounded like he had an unhealthy amount of phlegm stuck in his throat, and it was trying to escape. I walked gently towards the bed he slept in, feeling the warmth of the crackling fireplace envelop my body from the chilly air. The cloak of darkness largely hid the house in shadow, but the fireplace put a spotlight on the cozy living room decorated with an antique oak couch with a bearskin rug underneath. Considering who I was dealing with, I was sure he made that rug himself. The wall closest to his bed was filled with taxidermy heads of various animals. Deers, bears, even a caribou, all mounted proudly on wooden plaques. I stopped focusing on the details of the cabin and quietly marched towards the snoring monster, my rock at the ready. I stood over him and raised the rock high above my head, prepared to slam it down directly into his head. I won't lie, my arms were shaking something fierce and my breath caught in my throat. I was hesitating and unsure if I was really capable of bludgeoning this guy in his sleep. I tried to reassure myself that because he was asleep, he would be killed painlessly if I was able to crush his skull quickly enough. I'm not sure if I was breathing too hard or this was fate getting back at me, but he woke up and groggily looked at me with tired eyes. After a second, he jumped out of bed with phenomenal speed and lunged at me, slamming me into the ground and making me drop my rock. I came face to face with him, and he was already starting to change into his werewolf form. In hindsight, I still don't know how he was able to change into his werewolf form so quickly, but that's neither here or there. His face began to stretch and contort grotesquely. His nose began to morph into his face, which expanded like a fleshy Pinocchio snout. His pupils dilated, and his teeth and gums shifted into the sharp, fang-like teeth of a Rottweiler. Without wasting a moment, I jammed my hand into his face and tried to claw the spaces where his fur didn't grow in yet. The few fleshy spots began to melt, like peeling paint, and he recoiled, jumping off of me and clutching his face with his claws, whimpering like a puppy. I rolled and got back up on my feet and scanned the ground to find my rock. Instead, I saw a rusty black fireplace poker leaning against the fireplace, so I grabbed the poker and dipped the top into the fire, letting the metal heat up. I spun around and charged at the werewolf, who had stopped clutching his face and snarled at me, a look of utmost primal rage in his eyes, his human eyes. I lunged and swiped the poker across his face with as much fury as I could muster, slashing through his fur and flesh like a hot knife through butter. I popped his eye and singed the right side of his cheek, causing him to howl loudly. I recoiled and jammed the poker into his right foot, twisting the poker until I heard the cracking of bone. I wasted no time with lurching at him, grabbing his thick, furry neck and doing my best to strangle him in time so his throat could crumble away to nothing. My violent and sudden attack caught him off guard, and soon his dog-like whimpers became more and more muffled as my hands took hold of his throat, rapidly getting slimmer between my fingers. I felt chunks of hair and dust pass through my fingers as his cries became muted and his pupils dilated with the cold glaze of death approaching him. I had held on to his neck for so long that his head was too big for his dwindling neck to support and would have snapped at the slightest touch. I let go and let his lifeless body slump against the floor, blood pooling around his lifeless body. I felt a rush of adrenaline disorient me, making me lose my balance and tumble to the floor. I killed him. He's dead at my hands. It felt so surreal. Never in a million years could I envision myself to be a killer, even if what I was killing was monsters. Everything felt so disingenuous. Being a child hitman, killing people with superpowers and fire pokers, I would have laughed at the absurdity of it all if I was in a better mood. Something just didn't sit right with me. I came into this mission feeling righteous and cocky, but now reality crashed and I finally felt the weight's grasp on me. I could have died. It was blind luck and quick thinking that kept me alive, really. I came in with almost no plan, no weapon, and expected to come out victorious and unscathed. I mean, I did kill him and came out virtually unscathed, but it all felt hollow. I was looking at this as if it's a game with clear-cut winners and losers, but I was deceiving myself from the truth. I'm a cold-blooded killer and I just slaughtered a man. It was for a good cause, right? Who knows what kind of violent mayhem he could have gone on had I not done what I did. It's for the good of everybody, no matter how I feel. But I knew I had to become accustomed to this feeling. This was the life I agreed to. This is my career, my calling. I had no idea how Boss would react if I quit on the spot, nor did I want to think about it. I got up from the floor and yanked the poker from the werewolf's foot and disintegrated it, letting the dust fall to the floor. I wasn't sure where to go from here. Would anyone come looking for this guy? I knew Boss would gather the corpse and scrub any evidence of my crime, but he would still be missing. I just prayed that he was living off the grid, isolated from the world. His house seemed to suggest that, so my hopes weren't unfounded. I left the cabin and made my way back to the McDonald's parking lot, using the night vision goggles to guide myself. I sat down in my car and let the events play in my mind, again and again, soaking up what just happened. I wasn't keeping track of time, so I had no idea how long I was sitting still. Only when a faint glimpse of the morning sun gleamed through the sky did I come to and snap out of my internal conflict. I turned on my phone, saw that my bank account just received a direct deposit. I opened my app and saw that $7,500 had just been transferred to my account by an unlisted source. I still don't know how banks never caught on to Boss's direct deposits, but I'm sure he has his reasons. Once I saw the money, I knew what I needed to do. I can't be this naive and foolhardy. I have to be ready. I need to be prepared, come in armed to the teeth with weaponry, knowledge, and an airtight plan, and come out on top. The only bills I had to pay is car insurance, so I had thousands of dollars at my frivolous fingertips. I decided there and then that this paycheck would go to all the things I needed to get an edge and survive my new occupation. I need to learn how to fight. I need weights to train with, and I need gear to cover my tracks. I felt a flicker of determination through my entire body and started my car. I didn't want to go home just yet, but I didn't feel safe being a sitting duck out here. This is my life now. I need to get used to this feeling. I promised myself that no matter how long I live, I will always remember this day and how it made me feel. And I've kept that promise to this day, and I'm in a more confident place because of it. For those of you who don't know, the old high school I attended was a victim to an absolute paranormal shit show that rocked my worldview and landed me this job in the first place. It started right in the morning during a class of summer school I was in with 2 other students. We received an emergency weather warning over the intercom during an intense thunderstorm, but the announcement gave us peculiar instructions, like not contacting 911, instead of telling us to wait for emergency services to come find us. As I later learned, these emergency services were actually a squadron of highly secretive government agency tasked with eliminating the various monsters that began to roam free in the school. I've yet to ever get an official explanation as to how these monsters even got to our school in the first place, but I'm assuming that they got there like how nearly all monsters get to Earth. Through pandemonium, the interdimensional city boss rules over. If you want a good reason as to why people have jobs like mine, this is it. I don't know how many lives were lost that day, nor do I really want to entrench myself in the details. People like me do our best to ensure that this doesn't happen, that regular people don't have to become aware of and die at the hands of things that shouldn't exist in the first place. To summarize the event, all of the survivors were escorted by that government branch and were treated with some type of mind drug or hypnosis. I wasn't there, so I don't have a clue as to what they did. And they forgot the entire incident. The story they all told the media was that the extreme weather conditions caused the school to shut down, and that various EMS people came in and rescued them. I never saw any firefighters or cops near the school, but it's possible they came later once I and a friend left the school. I don't know much about the government branch that managed to cover all this up. What I can say for sure is that this was definitely not their first paranormal encounter. The few agents I met seemed way too at ease and comfortable for this to be a new experience. I did, however, see a logo that they all seemed to carry around, a patch with 3 skulls holding a book, fist and a blank bore diagram in their mouths respectively. For clarity, I'm going to be referring to this organization as the Skulls until I can find an official name for these jokers. I'm reluctant to search for them on the internet, but the little searching I did held absolutely no results for them. Not a Wikipedia page or even WikiLeaks page in sight. I really wouldn't recommend trying to find any details about them because their reach and influence is pretty frightening and can land you in some hot water. I had an encounter with them some time ago that I discussed in the comment section, but I'll elaborate here. A couple of days after I escaped the school, my mother heard a knock on the door and found that 2 strange men, as she described them, were standing there, looking intimidating and professional. They were wearing matching black suits and sunglasses, so she couldn't tell them apart. They asked her about the weather disaster at the school that occurred and wanted to know how I got home from the event. I lied to Mom and said that I drove home as soon as the emergency broadcast played, so that's what she told them. According to her, both of them left in a hurry and drove off right after, and haven't come back since. I don't know how this sounds to anyone reading this, but hearing this recounted by my mother was deeply concerning. They know where I live, and there's probably a good chance they know that I remember everything, making me a target to their insidious mind wiping. Sadly, the claustrophobic feeling of being watched has stuck with me to this day, putting an enormous amount of pressure on me. For this reason, I always like to cover my tracks, both in the literal sense and the metaphorical sense. I only pay for things in cash, always use a VPN when I'm on the internet, and I try not to give away too many private details about my life, even when I'm typing here. I know I might come off as being paranoid, but I know that my efforts weren't in vain. If I'm not careful, I'll get caught and mind wiped. I managed to escape with someone named Felipe, who at the time was my best friend. In a way, we were survival buddies. We managed to fend off the various monsters roaming in the school and escaped the school with the skin off our backs and drove home. Felipe may have been my first and only friend, but he meant so much more to me than that. He was my better half, someone who understood me and accepted me for who I was. I cherished him with the understanding and thoughtfulness of a brother, and the skulls took him away from me. They found him and stole his memory without a second thought, feeding him a lie about a weather phenomenon in place of what really happened that day. When I called him, he didn't recognize me in the slightest, and now wants nothing to do with me. As much as it hurts to lose him, I really think it's for the better. This line of work is dangerous, so the fewer people I associate with, the chance of them being injured or killed is minimized. All around, it was a complete fucking disaster that I don't ever want to go through again. Sorry for going on such a tangent. I just felt like I needed to get some things off my chest. Now that that's over, let's get started with the 2 tales I have for tonight. Keep in mind that the numbers I list with these targets are in order based on how many I've taken out. Target number 12, Hybrid. By this point, it's been nearly 2 months since my first target, so I was considerably more prepared and confident with this contract. I started a fairly intensive workout schedule, designed to build muscle as fast as possible, so I could stand a fighting chance against my targets and not get torn to pieces in the blink of an eye. By then, I could effectively bench press my body weight with the help of a pound of protein powder every day. I'd also managed to find a remote little shop far from home that sold various old military tools at an affordable price. I accumulated quite the pretty penny over time, so I had completely free range to spend as much as I want on whatever I could conceal. I ended up buying a fantastic vintage olive green army jacket with loads of nifty pockets to store all my tools in, and the sharpest looking knife I could find, which was an elegant and exotic kukri knife. Over a foot long with a black handle, this baby looked sharp enough to chop through wood and bone alike, so I paid with cash and headed back home. Was this kukri illegal to carry? Most likely. But I still had no easy access to firearms, nor did I know how to fire one. So for the time being, I was stuck with melee weapons to defend myself. According to the report I got sent in the mail, Hybrid appeared to be some type of roughly humanoid insect creature that stalked the city streets of Dryden in the dead of night. I lived in a rural area, but the city was only an hour-long drive on the highway, so I could get there reasonably quickly. If I'm being honest, hybrid theory didn't really seem all that imposing. Standing at only 5'6", and described as barely fitting into the baggy gray sweatpants and hoodie it was always seen wearing, I really didn't see why I was told to take this thing out. By my account, it seemed likely that this was just some eccentric manlet who liked to take late-night walks. I didn't see any mentioning of it being dangerous or hostile to people, but I didn't question the contract and got my gear ready for nighttime. Since I would be roaming the well-lit city streets, I left the night vision goggles at home and only packed my kukri and flashlight with me. I started keeping the medkits I had in my car, so I was all packed and ready to become a city slicker for the night. I fed my parents another lie about heading out to a friend's place for the night and zipped down the highway, enjoying the cool night breeze on my face. As much as I enjoyed the wind blowing through my long, wavy hair, I felt I should get a haircut. I loved the length of my hair, but I'm not very fond of ponytails or buns, and long hair tends to cover your eyes if not properly maintained. Just as I was considering a stop at First Choice, I already pulled onto the ramp to get off the highway and get into the city, and got an eyeful of the environment. Compared to the brief view I had of pandemonium, the city of Dryden was as drab and dull as plain oatmeal. The ruddy browns of buildings and ugly grays of the roads and sidewalks weren't anywhere near the level of thrilling sights pandemonium had to offer. The sloppy, lazy building shapes all throughout Dryden gave the impression that the entire city was still a work in progress, and carried the amateurish appearance of being built by a rookie architect. Each building had flat, square roofs and 4 rectangular walls that didn't line up correctly, which complemented the warped, crumbling sidewalks that hugged the erratic building so tight it seemed like the concrete was fusing to the brick walls I realized that comparing a drab southern Canadian city to a multi-dimensional sci-fi-looking daytime utopia is hardly fair, but I still felt like it didn't measure up. I navigated the cramped streets and pulled into a well-worn parking lot, paid the dusty parking meter in cash, and started to scout the streets, looking for a short humanoid dressed in baggy gray clothing. Whilst I combed the illuminated streets, I began to think about what exactly I was hunting. The name hybrid stuck out to me as being both perplexing and unnerving. It was described as being a humanoid insect-like creature, so I instantly thought of the fly and imagined a mutated, gooey, fly-human monstrosity roaming the streets, leaving chunks of flesh and ooze behind it in a trail of sloppy slime, as it dragged its decaying body across the street, bringing great terror for anyone misfortunate enough to gaze at its ugly mug. I tried looking for a dark alley or enclosed space I could hide in to spot out hybrid while being cloaked by night, but I didn't have any luck. The buildings were too close to each other to have any sort of hiding space. While I continued to look, I noticed something a bit odd about the city, something I still don't understand. Dryden looked completely vacant, like no one had lived there in a fair bit of time. I didn't expect such a homey-looking city to be bustling on a cold Wednesday evening, but even the smallest cities and towns had a few people loitering around at night. Hell, even the rural farm town I hunted the Dogman at had more people around at night. Despite all the light provided from the rustic street lamps, I couldn't see a person, animal, tree, or anything. I thought to myself, surely this can't be because of hybrid, right? I'm just psyching myself out. Everyone is asleep. I pulled out my phone and the clock read 10:34 p.m. People still have work and school tomorrow, so it makes sense the streets would be dead. At least it makes my job easier, less people, fewer witnesses. I got tired of looking for an ally to hide in, so I decided to try and scale the wall of one of the buildings and perch myself on the roof and play the waiting game for hybrid to come outside. The building had a pretty squat, so I didn't have much trouble jumping off from an empty trash can and hopping on the flat roof. I rolled onto the roof and laid flat on top, preparing to scout out any potential sightings of hybrid. Sadly, the waiting game was still as boring and unintuitive as ever. It's not a game one can really improve at, but only find ways to take shortcuts. And for me, my shortcut was fiddling with my kukri. I swung it around like a baseball bat, holding the grip tightly and hearing the crisp air swooshing around my blade. I tried to swing it around like a lightsaber, but I didn't have enough fitness to look intimidating when I did. After some stretch of time I spent goofing off with my blade, I began to smell something strange approaching from the streets below. I could only describe it as a musty combination of mothballs and copious amounts of cheap perfume. It stuck out like a sore thumb among the damp and homely smells of Dryden, so I poked my head over the ledge of the roof, and sure enough I saw exactly what the report had detailed. A person cloaked by massively oversized gray baggy sweatpants and hoodie shambling through the streets, shifting from foot to foot, like it was drunk. I wasn't expecting to be terribly frightened by hybrid, but seeing it up close was almost comical. From where I was sitting, it looked even shorter than the report said. It claimed it stood at 5'6", but from what I saw, it was no bigger than 5'1", barely managing to fit inside the clothes it wore. I was confused as to how the report I was given was off so much by height, but I didn't know who to blame. Boss didn't make these himself, only gave them to me. I continued to watch the clumsy figure stumble across the street, looking completely inebriated. I tried to get a better view of its face, but the gray hood completely obscured it. I was worried that I had spotted a regular person walking instead of my target. I wasn't able to see any of the insect-like features hybrid was supposed to have, so I was still very much on the fence if I should pounce on it with my knife. My gut was telling me to wait for a quieter opportunity to strike, so I stayed hidden and kept my eyes on the figure. I kept on watching as it walked across the street, but it didn't look like it had anywhere to be specifically. It was moving aimlessly, changing directions, and stopping in place, seemingly at random. The distant sound of crickets made the figure jump and faced a small patch of grass near a park bench. The gray-clad figure skittered on the ground and collapsed, resting on its hands and knees on the grass, and I finally saw what it looked like. Its hood had flipped back, revealing an uncomfortable mishmash of human and insect features, reinstating my theory of this monster looking like the Fly. The figure had greasy brown hair tied into a painfully tight ponytail, connected to a gray, scaly scalp that was swamped with moist brown droplets of sweat. Their hands were covered in needle-thin hair with black, leathery skin that was as dark as the night sky, with 3 sharp, pincer-like fingers jabbing at the grass, looking for something. They quickly found their target, the noisy cricket making noise nearby, and plucked it out of the grass, raising the quivering insect above its gross head. It was hard to see this thing's head from the angle it was standing at, but I did catch a glimpse of its massive mosquito-like compound eyes. They were so large that they nearly took up all the space on its already large head, leaving maybe a quarter of its face untouched by the 2 massive spheres. A shiver went down my spine seeing this thing's gangly appearance in all its skin-crawling glory. Hybrid stuffed the squirming insect into its hoodie pocket and flipped its hood back up with its malformed hands, darting towards the street. Christ, that thing was fast. It hit the ground running and bolted so fast that I had trouble even spotting it. It turned a corner with great speed and darted around a small house, and I peered over the side of the roof to see. Hybrid swung open a door behind the squat house and jumped inside, locking the door behind it quickly. I waited a couple more minutes to ensure Hybrid would stay inside that building, and slowly descended from the roof, landing on an old recycling bin on the ground. I quietly paced to the house. Hybrid ran inside and pressed my hand against the doorknob, causing it to turn into dust. I pushed the door open slowly and was greeted by the smell of mold and must. I covered my nose with my sleeve and tried to spot Hybrid inside, but the darkness inside the house was hard to see through, and I didn't want to potentially draw attention to myself by turning on the lights. I tiptoed through the tiny home, avoiding the rotting furniture and peeling wallpaper scraps on the floor. Was this Hybrid's house, or just some house they happened to occupy for tonight? I knew nothing about Hybrid's sleeping patterns, so I was completely in the dark, metaphorically and literally. I found a small set of stairs and walked upstairs as slowly and precisely as I could, making sure not to cause any creaks. Once I got up the entire staircase, I was met with a tiny white wooden door that positively reeked of that pungent mold smell, mixed with a sickly sweet scent that I had become far too familiar with, the smell of rotting flesh. Hesitating to go inside, I crouched and tried to see underneath the door, and saw the outline of something near the door. It was too dark to see, but I could make out a general cone shape suspended in the air. To the left of the cone shape was Hybrid, standing on the room's ceiling upside down, clothing discarded and wrapped in 2 sets of massive, moth-like wings. I felt like I just stumbled upon a golden opportunity. Hybrid looked like it was sleeping, and I was a few steps away from collecting my paycheck. I slid my fingertips against the bottom of the door and rotted the wood until the door formed a hole big enough for me to fit my entire body in, and crawled inside. Once I got into the room, I carefully stepped inside the room and shuffled past all the debris on the floor. Piles of what looked like spider silk and various articles of women's clothing were strewn across the floor haphazardly, clustering around a musty mattress on the floor. Once I saw the various clothing articles, some gears started to turn in my head. The file didn't detail Hybrid's gender, but based on its height in the clothes, I could safely assume Hybrid was a female. Despite how old and moldy this place was, it still felt lived in, like someone was still occupying inside and living in these measly conditions. It didn't take long for me to put 2 and 2 together. Hybrid lived here. It's an uncomfortable thought that a bug monster might be hiding in a nearby house with no one knowing about it, but that's why people have jobs as I do. I snuck up towards Hybrid and wrenched my hands around where her leathery throat was, clenching it tightly as I felt the squirmy flesh harden and crumble between my palms. Unlike the Dogman in the previous part, Hybrid didn't wake up from my assault. I kept clenching my hands until both hands began to rub against each other and let go. Her neck was spindly enough for me to know that her vocal cords, I'm assuming she has them, she's still part human, right? Were completely gone, so she couldn't make any cries for help. I sighed deeply and felt like a weight had been lifted off of my back, glad that I was able to finish this task so quickly. Strangely, Hybrid's feet didn't lose any grip from the ceiling she was hanging from, even after what I did to her throat. I tried to check for a pulse on her wrist to confirm if she was dead and felt no movement. Right, she's dead, I thought to myself, preparing to turn around and sneak out. Boss was kind enough to take care of the evidence I left behind from my tasks, so I didn't have to worry about clearing the evidence. Before I left the room, I bumped into the dark cone shape that was suspended from the ceiling. I felt a warm sensation when I touched the shape, and my curiosity was thoroughly piqued. What is this thing? What kind of shit can Hybrid hoard in here? I thought to myself. I reached out to touch the anonymous object, making sure not to disintegrate it, and felt a smooth, silky feeling that radiated the same warmth I felt when I bumped into it. It tugged at the shape and stretched a strong piece of silk, which quickly snapped against the shape as I let go. I pulled out my kukri and made a careful light slash across the width of the shape and made a horrific discovery. There was the unmistakable outline of a withered, dry human body inside the shape. I stepped back in disgust and nearly dropped my knife on the ground. From the looks of it, Hybrid had wrapped some poor bastard in a silk cocoon and was draining it of all its inner fluids. The body was so dry and mangy that I couldn't even make out the gender. All I could see was an expression of horrible, agonizing shock stuck on its face. Shit, wasn't here fast enough. I thought to myself, feeling bad for not hunting after Hybrid fast enough. I couldn't tell how long the body had been dead for, but I knew that anybody at all was bad news and that I needed to be faster. I left the house feeling ashamed and drove back home, the horrific expression of the corpse lingering fresh on my mind. Who was that person? What were they doing in that cocoon? Were they minding their old business, or were they some type of wannabe monster hunter? I know I'll never get an answer for any of these questions, but I ask them anyway. I'm sorry if that tale ended on something of a sour note. It's just that I hate to see people hurt or dead, knowing that I could save them had I been fast enough. But Hybrid was dead, and it was dealt with. All I had to stress about until my next assignment was online schoolwork, so I couldn't mope for too long. Right when I got home, I checked my mail and found $4,000 in a sealed envelope waiting for me, courtesy of boss. Some time ago, I requested him to send me paper bills instead of direct deposits, just so my family doesn't get suspicious. So, that was the tale of Hybrid the Bug Person. I think it's one of my more standard cases, but I felt it was worth typing anyways. I specifically chose a more standard case for the first tale, so I could detail how an average hit is played out, so the crazier stories I tell feel as strange to you as they do to me. But the next one won't be quite as successful. This is one of the shitter cases I've done, and it still doesn't sit right with me. Still doesn't sit right with me. Still doesn't sit right with me.